Next in the build is to add the longitudinals, and these are stiffeners that run from one end of the bottom plates to the other. There are 4 longitudinals on each side and then one that runs down the centre line. Between the 2 main bulkheads, the centre longitudinal is interrupted because that's where you have to mount the engine and have the prop tube going through. And so to add a bit of extra stiffness in that area and also allow you to mount the engine, that's where the engine bearers go. We start with the engine bearers because they provide an extra stiffness to the bulkheads which we've already installed. As we added in each of the bulkheads from the previous video, you'll see that we also added in the engine bearers that touched up against them. And this was just to help support those as we made the installation. The engine bearers are 6 parts in total, so after we'd installed the bulkheads, it was just a case of fitting the centrepiece of each side. That centrepiece though does span the width of the butt weld of the bottom plates, and because we'd experienced a bit of distortion from the welding there, it meant that we had to use quite a lot of force to get those sitting properly. We used a digital spirit level to help get those engine bearers plumb and square across the boat. That was easy. With the engine bearers in, we could switch to installing the longitudinals. As with everything in the kit, all of the parts are both marked and labelled, so it's really easy to find the right part and install it in the right place. Working from the centre line out, we started with the engine bay and then worked our way forward and back. We did the other longitudinals first and did the centre line last and in places as we installed the frames, in order to help minimise the distortion when we welded the centre seam. The instructions say actually to avoid welding where the frames later cross over the longitudinals, and that's to give you a bit of wiggle room to help install the frames more easily. We did actually listen to that advice and it did help in places, but there were still places where the longitudinals were too stiff and we had to cut the tacks in order to get the frames in. Again, this is a place where you want to put nice small tacks in because you might well end up going back as we did and having to grind them out later. So on some of the longitudinals there are flat spots which later become part of the cabin sole, and you use those to make sure they're level fore and aft and also between longitudinals. And that's the only measuring that you have to do on the longitudinals. Towards the bow we found that although those lined up really nicely, however at the stern we found that they didn't, and if you'll remember back in the video about the bottom plates, we mentioned that we should have checked the angle of the bottom plates, and this is where you'll start to see some of that error creeping in, and we did end up having to go back and correct a lot of this later. Going back and correcting all of that took about an extra 3 weeks later on. You'll probably see in the time lapse that we use a few different methods to get the bottom plate to come up to the longitudinal. Mostly with the longitudinals we found that you just could weld on a small bracket onto the bottom plate and then use a pry bar over the top of the longitudinal to bring the two together. There are a bunch of different ways of doing the same sort of thing, and we'll probably chuck together a video all about that at some point. Installing the centre longitudinal means that you lose access to the centre seam of the boat, and so before we install that we would need to get it welded and ground back, as we wouldn't be able to weld it later. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next video. If you've enjoyed the content, please subscribe. So today's a big day because we're putting the rest of the frames onto the hull. By the end of the day it should mean it looks something like a boat. It may look like all the frames are in, but actually we've got to take them all down again. You can really start to see the shape of the whole boat come together. Things we do for filming.